Hey y'all, it's Megan from Made for Mermaids, and today we're working on the Morgan Sweetheart pattern. You're going to need to cut two front bodices in a main and lining piece on the fold. I'm doing the plain bodice in this video. If you want to see the ruche bodice, I'll link it down below. You also need two back pieces, again, one in your main, one in your lining on the fold. You need two waistband pieces on the fold, one for the front and one for the back. Then you're going to need to choose your sleeve length and what type of sleeve, and you'll need to cut two of those on the fold. This is the short sleeve version here. And then I'm doing the tiered dress. So there are pattern pieces or there's a measurement chart, and you'll need to cut a top tier, a middle tier, and a bottom tier for all the tiered skirt options. There's different numbers that you cut depending on what size that you're doing. The first step is going to be working on our front bodice. We're going to finish that neckline. So you're going to lay out your front bodice piece, and then with the right sides together, you're going to put the lining on top, just aligning the raw edges and all of the points, and you're going to sew the neckline with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I highly recommend using your sewing machine for this step because you're going to get a much cleaner finish. If you really want to use your serger, you can at least use your sewing machine right at the center V, so it's really nice and crisp. Then you're going to just clip that center V to the seam allowance, but not through the seam allowance. The next step is going to be to add 1/4 inch clear elastic inside of that seam allowance. This is so your neckline doesn't get droopy or stretched out while on the wearer or on yourself. So again, I like to use my sewing machine for this step. You just start at the outside and work your way towards the center. Once I get to the center, then I clip the elastic and I start over from the center to the outside. If you're looking for what stitches I use, that is all in the tutorial. After you finish sewing that clear elastic, then you're going to want to take it to your ironing board and carefully press that seam and press it so the right sides are out. The next step is going to be to understitch that seam. So again, you're going to press the seam allowance towards the lining, and then you're going to top stitch on the lining side, catching the seam under. This will help your lining from rolling towards the right side and also keep that elastic in place. Then you can set that front bodice aside, and we're going to be working on the back bodice. So you'll put the back bodice main and lining right sides together, and we're going to stitch them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the top. I'm just showing you here, if you would like to use your serger, how to do that. You're going to want to add the clear elastic to the seam as you are serging. After you get those stitched together, then you're going to do the same thing as we did on the front bodice. Take it to your ironing board, give it a nice press, and then go ahead and understitch this side as well. So press that seam allowance towards the lining and top stitch on the lining side, catching the seam underneath. Again, this will prevent the lining from flipping towards the right side. Next, we're going to sew the side seam. So you're going to open your back bodice and lay it out flat, and then open your front bodice and do the same. You're going to want to align them together at the side seams, making sure that your linings are matching and that your main fabrics are matching. Then we're going to stitch them together at the side seams using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then you'll want to press that lining towards the wrong side and press the main fabric out, just aligning all the side seams and the bottom raw edges. Now it's time to work on our sleeve. So no matter what sleeve you chose, you're going to press the top down towards the wrong side by a half of an inch, and you're going to edge stitch along that pressed edge. That's to create the top elastic casing. Once you have that top edge finished, you're going to go ahead and press your bottom hem. So if you're doing the flutter sleeve or the 3/4 or long sleeve, you will press the bottom by a half of an inch towards the wrong side. I'm doing the short sleeve here, so if you're doing the short sleeve, you're going to press the bottom 1 1/4 inch up. And this is just creating a memory press on the bottom. We're not going to actually stitch it yet. So you'll unfold that memory press and then sew the side seams of your sleeve with a half an inch seam allowance. Once your side seams are sewn, you're going to repress that bottom edge. And on this short sleeve, you're going to first stitch half an inch from your top raw edge. So in half an inch, you can either mark this, or what I do is I just use the markings on my sewing machine as a guide. So half an inch from the edge, you're going to sew all the way across. Then we're going to stitch again. This time you're going to stitch right along that top raw edge, and you're going to want to leave a 1 inch opening so we can thread our elastic on this one. So this short sleeve has a little ruffled bottom, and so we're creating the elastic casing here. If you chose the flutter sleeve, then you would just simply edge stitch that half inch hem, or you can leave your flutter sleeve raw and it'll be half an inch longer. On your 3/4 or long sleeve, then you would edge stitch it just like we did this top one, leaving a 1 inch opening to thread the elastic through. The next step is to thread the elastic, so you need to thread both the shoulder elastic and then on the short 3/4 and long sleeve also the hem of the sleeve elastic. So I use a safety pin and I just start pushing the elastic through until the elastic is almost to the edge. You don't want to pull it too far. Then you'll use your sewing machine to hold just a few stitches to hold the elastic down. Then you continue to push the elastic through with your safety pin, and then take the safety pin out and tack down the other side. Now, if you want to, you can baste the elastic and then quickly baste your sleeve on and try it on yourself or your wearer to see if you need to adjust the elastic. If you know you have smaller shoulders or a smaller frame, you may need, or if you're shorter, you might need to adjust the elastic by making it a little bit tighter. After you get the shoulder elastic, then you're going to thread the elastic the same on that bottom hem, again just on the short 3/4 and long sleeves. Once you get the elastic through, then you need to stitch it together with a couple zigzag stitches by overlapping it by half of an inch, and then you will go back and edge stitch the rest of the casing so it is closed. Then once that bottom sleeve elastic is in, you'll kind of want to move the elastic around so you can evenly distribute it. On the top shoulder elastic, I like to push all of the elastic towards the center so the sides where you're going to be attaching it to the bottom are not gathered and flat, and then you'll just repeat that whole process on the other sleeve. Now it's time to attach the sleeves to the bodice. Make sure the right side is out, and you're going to align your bodice so that the side seam is centered, and with the side seam of the sleeve matching to the side seam of the bodice, you're going to pin those together. Then you're going to pin the elastic top edge of the sleeve to the back bodice, and then the other side of the sleeve to your front bodice. These should all align here. You shouldn't have to have too much stretching, and then you'll just pin the rest of your sleeve. Again, I highly recommend using your sewing machine for this step, or at least basting the sleeve on before you use your serger, because the serger can pull, especially the elastic, a little bit, and then the top edge of your bodice and your sleeve won't be even. You're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance here to stitch the sleeve to the bodice. Then you're going to repeat this with the other sleeve. If you used a serger on that step, then I like to use a needle to thread the serger tail back down through the seam, and then I will press that seam either towards the sleeve or the bodice and do a little stitch, just a bar tack, to hold the seam in place on all of those sleeve seams. And the next step is to sew our band. So with right sides together, you'll put the band together and sew them at the side seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Take note, especially in the adult or older use sizes, the waistband will be smaller on one edge, and that edge is going towards the skirt or the hem on the top. So the side that connects with the bodice is slightly wider. We're going to quarter the band by finding the center front and back just by sticking the side seams together, and then we're going to do the same with the bodice. So put the side seams together to find the center front and back. Then with the right side of the band to the right side of the bodice, matching the side seams and center front and back, you will stitch the band to the bodice with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you would like to, you can press that seam towards one side and top stitch it in place. If you're doing the tiered skirt version, either the dress or maxi, I highly recommend adding some knit interfacing to the bottom of your bodice like I have here. You can also use clear elastic, and this is to stabilize the seam for the weight of the skirt. Next, we're going to sew our tier side seam. So you're going to put the top tiers together with the right sides together and sew them with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then repeat with all the tiers. So your middle tiers, put those together and sew them, and then your bottom tier you'll put together. Depending on your size, you may have 3, 4, 5 pieces that you're sewing together, so make sure to note the pattern piece or the measurement chart when you're cutting your skirts. All of these seams have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you're doing the long maxi versions or the midi versions, or you're doing a dress version and you're using a little bit lighter weight of a fabric like a bamboo or a rayon, you may want to add some clear elastic to these tier side seams to help prevent the skirt from stretching out and for it becoming longer and longer and longer with wear and the weight of the skirt. So then you should have all of your tiers sewn together with the side seams, or you may have multiple seams, again depending on your sizes and how many pieces you needed to fit that tier. So there's the top tier and the middle tier and then the bottom tier. I have gone ahead and quartered my tiers, so I have all my quarter points marked with pins. On the bottom tier, it is very wide, as you can see. So what I like to do is when we're gathering this next step, we're going to gather that top edge of the bottom tier, and I like to gather it in quarters. That way when I start to pull the gathering stitches, they are not going to break because this is so wide. So if you try to gather it just in one go, your gathers are going to be really uneven and you are more likely to break thread. So you can see there, I have a pin for my quarter point. So I will stop right there and then go back and do my next row of gathering stitches. I always do 2 rows, even though this does take a little bit of time. I'm always happier with the results when I do it this way. So I do 1 gathering stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge, and then I do another gathering stitch 5/8 inch from the edge, and I will do this 4 times on this bottom tier. So I have split my bottom tier into, instead of quarter points or just matching the centers and side seams, because your bottom tier is made up with more than 1 piece of fabric, you're gonna have more than just 2 seams. So I always split it into 8ths because it's so wide. Again, I am a little bit more picky about my gathering and I want it to be as even as possible. So on the bottom edge of the middle tier, I split it into 8ths, and then my actual bottom tier, I also split it into 8ths. And I will match all of those points with pins, and then after they're matched, I will start pulling my gathering stitches to match the bottom tier to the middle tier. Again, this does take a little bit more time, but I'm always happier with the results when I do it this way. Once I have that whole long bottom tier gathered to match the middle tier and all of those points pins, I'm going to take it to my sewing machine, and I really prefer to, again, use that sewing machine instead of my serger, at least to baste it on. I find that if I go straight in with my serger, that sometimes it flattens the gathers out, and I do not like that. So I use my sewing machine first, and then I go back and I finish the edge with my serger. I make sure to press the gathers very well with my iron after I sew it with my sewing machine before I go to my serger, and then again after I sew it to my serger. And then after that, you're going to pull the gathering threads out, and if you would like to, you can press the seam up towards the middle tier and top stitch it in place. Now we're just going to rinse and repeat. We're going to do the same thing for the next tier. So I'm going to be gathering the top edge of the middle tier with 2 rows of gathering stitches. Since this one isn't as wide as the bottom tier, I gather it in 2 portions instead of 4. So I do the front skirt and the back skirt separately. So do those 2 rows of gathering stitches and then match the quarter points, or you can do the 8ths points, which again is what I like to do so my gathering is nice and even. So you just find those points on the bottom edge of the top tier, and we will match the side seams and those points together, and then pull the gathering threads so that the middle tier matches the top tier width. Then you're going to sew those together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, I use my sewing machine first, then go back with the serger, and you can press the seam up towards the top tier and top stitch. Then again, rinse and repeat. Do the exact same thing with the top tier. So gather the top edge of the top tier, then match the top tier quarter points or eighth points to the bodice with the right sides together, and we're going to sew those together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure on each step that you are pressing your gathers and your skirt. This will help the gathers look nice and professional. And then your Morgan is complete. If you make one, we would love to see it posted in our Facebook group or tag us on Instagram at Made for Mermaids with the hashtag Morgan pattern, hashtag Made for Mermaids. We always love to see them. If you have any questions, you can leave them down below and I'd love to answer. The other versions of the Morgan pattern are linked down below in the description.